Welcome, everyone. If you're coming in, we've got quite a few people joining us today. We've got a panel of some of the most interesting people in accessibility with us today. But give us a couple minutes. We're just getting started. We're just getting people coming in. And as people are streaming in, feel free to jump into chat, say hi, let us know where you're coming in from. And we'll get started probably about 3 minutes after the hour. Hey, this is great seeing all these familiar faces coming in too. But if you're new to Stark or if you're new to us, definitely feel free to say hi or introduce yourselves on chat.
Snowy Austin, Texas. That would be
Oh,
Raquel.
it would be Raquel. Yeah, no, they're having ice storms there now. So I suppose we should be thankful that she's got power and she's got internet.
I know.
We'll see how long it lasts, but fingers crossed, everyone.
Fingers crossed indeed. Oh man, Treg, the fact that it's minus 22 Celsius that's a big old nope for me.
Yeah, that's like knives on your skin when it's that cold.
Yeah, it's like the air hurts your face. You don't want to be anywhere that the air hurts your face.
Erin, are we still letting people in, or are we kind of
There's people trickling in,
settle down a
but
little
here and there, I think we can get started. There's some people trickling, but all good.
Okay. Well, first off, I want to let you know that today's meetup is being recorded. So this recording will eventually be posted either on the Stark site or on Meetup. But if you have an issue with recording, now's your chance to kind of bail here. If you haven't noticed yet, we have Beth Wagmeister, who is our sign language interpreter. And if you do need an interpreter, hopefully you'll know to pin her and to have her always on your screen right now. We have captions. So you should be able to see a CC or a live transcript link at the bottom of your Zoom window. And with that, you should be able to get captions happening for this meetup. If you need anything else, if there are any other sort of needs or accommodations or anything that we can do to make your experience better, definitely let us know. Let us know in chat. And then another thing that helps us kind of keep tabs on things is our chats get a little bit hyperactive. People start like going away and, there's a whole lot going on there. If you do have a question, start it with a Q and a colon, because that's going to make it a whole lot easier for whoever's going back and letting us know what your questions are. So we're going to keep it pretty informal. We're not going to do like a separate Q&A tab. So everything is kind of jumbled in there. So having the Q will definitely help us out. If you don't know me and if you don't know Kat, we are from Stark. We have a few other folks from Stark on this meetup as well. Kat is our CEO, and Kat is she's an entrepreneur. She's like, from my experience working for Kat, she's also a master plate spinner, and I've never seen anybody be able to spin more plates at once than Kat. Myself, I'm head of strategy, which is kind of a unique role. So I get to do a little bit of speaking, a whole lot of teaching, and kind of put on the sort of goggles that let me kind of see a little bit into the future. So my role is a little bit forward looking. With this, we also have Reginé Gilbert. She's a designer. She's an author. She's a professor at NYU, and she is probably one of our best voices in accessibility. She has a book on accessibility, which is a really good book for someone who is new to the field and who's really trying to understand a lot of how accessibility and design relate to each other. I also have Sheri with us, and Sheri Byrne Haber is probably the most prolific blogger about accessibility. If you don't follow her on Medium or any of the other channels where she's blogging, you should. And Sheri, you probably put out about easily, what, 1 or 2 articles a week. And I honestly, I don't know how you do it. You know, just the volume, the research, and the insight that you bring to us is just phenomenal. And finally, we also have Nick Steenhout. And Nick is the host of the Alley Rules podcast. And what Nick, I think, is particularly good at is that he brings in guests with different disabilities and gets them to speak about their experiences with technology or their experiences with their disabilities. And they're never the sort of textbook sort of explanations that you'd expect. They're always very personal and they're always very unique. And so if you haven't subscribed to Alley Rules, and as a podcast, you probably should. Ooh. So today what we're doing is we are presenting about Mike Oliver. I'm sorry, I lost my share here. And Mike Oliver, today's his birthday. It's February 3rd. And Mike Oliver was one of the premier disability advocates in the UK. And he was very active in the 70s and the 80s. In the 80s, he wrote a book on social work and disability in which he used for the first time the term the social model. And Mike Oliver was also the very first professor of disability studies in the world. He taught at the University of Kent, and he was the first to write about the social model. So what is the social model? Well, the social model is it's a shift in worldview that is, I would say it's up there with Copernicus, who realized that the Earth goes around the sun as opposed to the other way around. So the social model is kind of like that. And it is, instead of thinking of a disability coming from a person's individual physical impairment, you think, well, the disability actually comes from the mismatch between a person and their environment, and that mismatch is caused by society. So actually it is society which disables people with physical impairments. So I'm going to stop sharing. And what I'd like to do is start opening it up, to the panelists and talking about what do you feel is the social model, or is there something that I've left out of this explanation of the social model?
I think a few things. One is the value of the human and the person, right? Because with the other models, such as the medical model, the person is centered in a different way and not necessarily valued. That's just one thing. I'd love to hear from Nick or Sheri.
For me, the social model was a revelation. I came to it when I started working in the independent living movement way back when. And it was a revelation to start shifting, as Claudio was saying, complete paradigm shift where the doctor isn't the specialist about my condition anymore. I am. And shifting that and starting to think maybe the problem isn't that I use a wheelchair, but the problem that there's steps everywhere to get into buildings. That was so powerful to me. It still has reverberation today. So that's really a critical shift in thinking.
So I guess to understand the social model a little bit better, I think we should probably step back a little bit and maybe talk about, how we looked at things before the social model came about. And and Mike Oliver, he would call it the individual model, I think, and he would rail about medicalized disability. I think now, 30 years later, we'll talk about it not as the medicalized disability, but we would call it the medical model. And I think, some of us have come to it in different paths. I mean, Kat, you kind of had a unique path because you were actually, like in the medical profession.
Yeah, so I was pursuing pediatric neurology. And so it was, admittedly, this is not something that's often taught to, self-taught designers. It's not in the, the foundational practices of things that you should learn if you're, learning design. I've been designing since I was in high school, but by all standards was very much so self-taught. And so once I dove in, it wasn't a part of it. I worked in, I'd been pursuing obviously medicine. I worked for the New York City Board of Education. I worked for the Helen Keller School. And at that point, I realized that it wasn't just products that could be designed, it was systems. And through there, it was this domino effect. And it took quite a bit of time and really rabbit holing into the space of accessibility and understanding everything that comes with it. And I say that knowing good and well, I don't know everything that comes with it. And as technology evolves, so too does our understanding. And so when I think about the medical model, it took quite a bit of bifurcation and wrestling, because, and I don't mean wrestling as in I disagreed with the social model, wrestling in that I kept going back to what I knew of the medical model and kept trying to fit it into how the social model makes sense, and it just was, it was a hot mess. And so, overall though, medical model, just for those who aren't aware, I think the most basic example, or rather basic description, would be that the medical model looks at what is by all standards wrong with a person and not what a person actually needs in life, and it really puts the burden on the disabled individual or the individuals with disabilities as like, well, medicine is this cure-all, right? It tries to remedy disability through whatever medical cure is out there, or trying to make a person appear as less disabled or more normal, knowing good and well realistically what the fuck does that even mean. So
yeah, there's like different goals, like in the medical model, because it's medicalized, you're trying to fix somebody, you're looking for a cure.
But yes.
And so you're looking for a medical cure, but in the social model, it's kind of like, well, you need to look at the person's well-being beyond that. So that could be economic, that could be how you get around, how you get stuff done.
Well, the interesting thing is that when you study medicine, you get to a certain point, you become a doctor, you take the Hippocratic Oath, and you take an oath to do no harm, right? By all standards, I would argue, and maybe I can't, maybe statistics show otherwise, but I would argue that most doctors that take that Hippocratic Oath are well-intended, right? But still, one thing that's never asked is, how do we define no harm? What is harm to different people?
So I just glanced over, to chat, and there's a conversation. I see the word normal there, and I want to kind of steer the conversation towards that a little bit. Where in the medical model, what you look at as being kind of the statistical norm is also treated as the ideal and what people should adhere to. But what happens as you start diverging from that?
I think I just want to touch on this because just last night in my a class I teach called Looking Forward, which is an assistive technology class teaching students about the assistive tech that blind and low vision folks use, we talked about ableism last night. And specifically, the person I teach with, Gus Chalkias, is blind, and we wanted to let the students know that the word normal is not to be used in this class, and because what does that mean? What does normal mean? There are other words that can be used in place of it, and the students were just like, the mind's blown, because it's like, wait a minute, what does normal mean? And that's not something that we should really be using, in my opinion.
Right. So what were you telling your students to use instead?
Well, Gus says that he likes the word typical. So it's just a bit of a better word to use in explaining things versus normal, because what is the basis for normal? And so what, somebody's not normal? I don't get it. So I think there are other words that we can find. But another thing I want to address too is for people who have English as a second language, and who watch maybe a lot of movies and learning about English, a lot of the words that are used in TV and film are quite ableist, and they don't realize that they're maybe saying something, that's not, acceptable for someone else. And so I think we have to keep that in mind when we're talking with people, that English may not be people's first language, if it is English, and work with that.
It is the funny thing about like TV and film that we probably don't realize, is that we're looking back into a time machine. So, if we're watching programming from another time, I mean, we're going to be seeing also the language from another time. And a lot of it comes with the sort of cultural baggage that we're trying so hard in the present to shake off. One of the things that I remember as a kid watching TV was the Jerry Lewis telethon. And, that is something that, if you mentioned it to the disability advocates of that era, I mean, they despised it. And it was all about getting somebody on screen to raise money for a cure, for a disability, and the money went to medical research. It never went to improving, as far as I know, the lives of the people that were affected with muscular dystrophy, and it was totally accepted, and it was celebrated in the press and everything, and it's what we would call the charity model. I mean, I don't know. I mean, to what extent would you folks feel that the charity model persists today?
Well, I see it, quite frequently, because I work for a global company that has.
Oh, Sheri, you muted
Sorry.
yourself.
Yeah, so I work for a company that's very global. We have development centers in countries that would be considered developing nations. So I'll just give you an example. I was giving a talk once to a group of people in South Asia about how to make the software work for people with disabilities. In particular, I was trying to teach them how to use something called ARIA. And it was a long presentation. And at the end, I said, okay, let's wrap this up. Do you have any questions? And one person said, yeah, I've got a question. And I'm like, great, go ahead. And he said, why would blind people want to work? So, and this did not happen that long ago. So even within today, where you might live in a country that has adopted largely the social model, you're never going to completely escape the influence of the medical model and the charitable model that exists in other countries.
One of the things that kind of gets me to cringe is when people cite like X number of people with disabilities in the world, or X number of people in the world have a disability, and it's from a World Health Organization study in 2011. All the information, all the data that went into that is 100% medical model when it comes to certain countries. So you imagine if you're asking the Minister of Health from X country in Southeast Asia, they're going to give you the statistics of the people who have diagnosed a diagnosis of a condition.
And probably mostly visible disabilities, when we know that 70% plus or minus of disabilities are invisible.
Correct.
Right. So those statistics, I kind of cringe a little bit every time I hear that, because I'm going like, that's just based on so many assumptions that we already know are false. And that data is at least 11 or 12 years old. So, but unfortunately, we haven't gone back, we haven't revisited this, and we haven't done another study along those lines. So Sheri, I mean, speaking about like the problems that might come, from the sort of old school medical model thinking, I mean, how would you go about like seeing where the issues trace back to?
So, whenever we have an issue related to disability where I work, you always want to do a root cause analysis. And so I come originally from a software testing background before I got into accessibility. And a root cause analysis means not only do you fix the problem, you have to do this analysis to figure out, well, what really caused the problem in the first place. So a workplace example might be that somebody designed something and it needed an accessibility feature to it, or an accessibility component to it, and it was missed. Okay, well, why was that? Why did that happen? Well, it might be because the accessibility team was too small and didn't get participation in the project. Well, then why don't you have other employees with disabilities who might be able to raise accessibility issues? Well, then you start looking at, well, what's preventing us from hiring people with disabilities? Is it our recruiting process? Is it our onboarding process? Is it that we can't keep employees with disabilities because we don't have a good accommodations process, or we don't have a good employee resource group? So the problem might be we released inaccessible software, but the cause of the problem is usually in the process or something underlying that created the barrier that ended up resulting in the problem.
Right. And a lot of times it's almost a circular thing. Like, and there's like the circular logic of like, well, we don't have blind people in the organization. And then you start doing the root cause analysis, like, well, why don't we have blind people in the organization? Right. And it's not as linear as most people would like to think. You've got to take a few steps back. But I think the fact that you are digging deeper for a root cause is just so much more important.
I'd like to just briefly tell the story of my mechanic. He was great in Chicago. I went to him and it was really fantastic. He was cheap, he was quick, he was honest, but he had one step in front of his front office. And I kept telling him, why don't you put in a ramp? And he says, well, Nick, you're the only wheelchair user that comes to me. Why should I put in a ramp? And I looked at him and I said, well, why do you think I'm the only one? And then the penny dropped. You realize, oh, my office is not accessible, so people aren't tempted to come here. He spent a few $100, put in a ramp, and suddenly he had about a dozen clients with wheelchair user clients. So there's that thing, if you don't do the things that you need to do to get this attraction, then you're not going to have the wide variety of disabled people as staff. If your internal systems are not accessible, if your hiring process, if you rely on online resume submissions that are not accessible, you're not going to get the disability pool of applicants that might make a big difference to your internal diversity.
If you're not going to use the right language when hiring people, you're not going to get the right people.
Yeah, I just wrote an article about getting rid of subjective requirements from job descriptions. Yep. So I'll give you another really current example. This happened within the last 18 months, where a Fortune 500 company was advertising for a director of graphics design. And one of the requirements literally listed in the job description was that the person had to be able to use a mouse and a keyboard simultaneously. And I'm like, seriously?
Who does that anyway?
I'm sorry?
I said, who does that anyway?
How is that related to the job? B, you might as well hang out a no disabled people need apply sign to that particular company. So, you know, that's kind of the recruiting equivalent of Nicholas's step.
Yeah, or you'll see, like, you know, hey, you're supposed to be able to lift 25 pounds. What, you lift,
or have a driver's license.
Are you gonna be moving your desk?
Yeah,
right.
30% of people don't have with disabilities don't drive. So when you put in these throwaway requirements that aren't really related to the job, what you're really doing is you're saying you don't want to hire disabled people.
It also goes down to communication as well, right? Especially in a remote world, communication is important, but communication isn't just this, what we're doing. So one thing we've always put from the beginning on our job applications is that one of the core skills has to be that you have an ability to communicate clearly and collaboratively in the method that's most comfortable and possible for you. And that changes everything, right? Because it says, well, there's an understanding that we collaborate and communicate differently. And that extends to people that are just distributed all over the world. It could be a language barrier. It could be a disability, right? There's a variety of things that are impacted there.
Yeah, there's so many people who include excellent verbal and written communication skills. Ooh. You know, another throwaway job requirement, where really excellent communicators are people who can shift their communication style to the comfort of the person that they're speaking with.
That is the core skill.
Right. And so recently at VMware, we started, at least in my department, and I'm trying to get this to happen everywhere, but it's a big company, to shift to effective and flexible communication skills as being the line item that we put for that in our job descriptions.
Sheri, of course, I think I remember seeing a post about this in detail as well, you know, in your blog. I guess that kind of begs for a broader question, which is, you know, how do you become more inclusive, not just in your hiring, but how do you, you know, become more inclusive and bring more people with a variety of different disabilities or you know, visible, invisible? How do you bring them into your process? So, I mean, Nick, for instance, like how do we find, you know, people with disabilities to ask? You know, where would you go, for instance?
You just walk up and down the streets and grab anybody that looks remotely not normal and you say, hey, are you disabled? Seriously, there's so many different ways. Online, if you're looking at remote access, there's you know, there's organizations like Nobility that run Access Works program, where they have a pool of disabled testers that you can interact with. Fable does something similar. If you're looking at just going on social media, Twitter, using the A11Y hashtag, you can ask questions and access interactions with so many different disabled people. Obviously, plug for my podcast that I linked to earlier, the Accessibility Rules soundbite. So if you want access to hear about accessibility and the words of disabled people without having to have that maybe awkward interaction, if you're not familiar with talking with disabled people, it's a good introduction. There's just so many ways.
Well, I've been known to grab people on the street with white canes and offer them jobs. So
as long as you don't grab them literally.
No. I usually start with the excuse me, you know, that Canadian part of training that comes back even though I live in the US now. But so some of the other places, and it might be US specific, I don't know, but Lighthouse for the Blind is another really good place to go to. AFB, American I can't remember if it's Foundation or Federation for the Blind. There's usually local chapters, there's centers for independent living, there's Facebook groups. I started a Facebook group for children with the syndrome that my daughter was born with, and now there's more than 2,000 members. So if you ever wanted, somebody with that particular disability, there you can go. And even though it's a 1 in 50,000 syndrome, there's the pocket of your exact audience, if that's the demographic that you're looking for.
And I like people to start in their own communities. I think we tend to look outside, and there's a lot, but within our own communities where we live, there are so many people, and I think we all know someone, and I think that we kind of forget to just open our door and look outside and see who's around us.
Reginé, don't you feel like there's maybe a little bit of hesitancy or some sort of baggage or learned behavior on the part of organizations, that kind of hold them back?
I mean, clearly, because they're not hiring enough. So I think that there's a lot of it's so layered. We only have a short amount of time for this talk, but there's so many layers to what's going on in terms of why people do or do not hire, why people use the language that they do in these posts. It all goes back to us, right, in our society, because I look at this as a greater societal issue, and I live in the United States, and so in the United States, the way that disability is viewed is to me, I don't like it, right? Like I feel like a lot of folks are really ignorant, and I think that there is an ongoing education that needs to happen for all of us, and it can be frustrating, but it is something that needs to be done, and I always go back to, where do you start? Because this is a question people often ask. It's like, how do I begin? How do I know how to talk to someone with disabilities? How do I, you have to start somewhere, right? And I'd love to hear from Nick and Sheri, because I know they have wonderful thoughts on this, but I think it always goes back to that, where do we start, right? Because people know what they know, they don't know what they don't know, but where can we start?
Nick, do you want to take this first?
I have to admit, I got distracted by Christina's question, so I missed the start of where do you start?
Okay, we'll pass it on to Sheri so you can have a second to catch up. Where do you start?
So one of the places that I always tell people to start with is the type of language that they use. In some areas, people first language is something that is used. I personally don't object to the word disabled. I feel that it's part of my identity. I think sometimes you'll find some difference between people who have congenital disabilities and people who have acquired disabilities. When you have so I'll give you another story. I was taking a DEI course once, and a woman got up, we were doing introductions, and she was talking about how she was training for the London Marathon and she injured her knee. And she was, really stuck in a, depression over that. And she was telling this story while she was standing next to me and I was in a wheelchair. So, totally different perspectives, right? I don't miss running marathons because I've never been able to do it. So I consider myself disabled. I don't have an issue with that word. I don't use it in a negative context. In the chat window, we've been talking about how much I hate using the word disabled in tech to talk about something that doesn't work. So that's something that we're trying also to work around at VMware. And I'm even having conversations with people at Oracle about it because it's actually embedded in Java. So there's only so much that VMware can change, because Oracle is actually, again, root cause analysis, that they are the source of that problem currently. Yeah, so disabled say the word. There's some great t-shirts that say that, but people first language versus identity first language versus, and then trying to stay away from the medical and charitable language, because the last thing that people with disabilities want is sympathy.
So let me ask a question here. Like, is the language the issue? Is the language kind of a red flag for an underlying cultural attitude? Is somebody using ableist language a spark for a conversation? Or is it, really something that should be corrected on the spot? I mean, like, I'm sure there's like many shades of gray in terms of like how you should approach this or handle it.
Yeah, so I think that you got it right on the head, Claudio. I think the language is a sign of the underlying attitudes. And if you can change the language, then hopefully you can alter the attitudes as well.
I find that most people are using this language without realizing that they are using bad language. And once you spark that conversation, get them started to think, then, I've had that conversation, and 6 months later, somebody comes back to me and they say, oh my, you just opened the world. And the more I think about different terms, the more I realize the problems. You also have these people that are saying, well, I don't mean it that way. I say something is crazy or something is lame. I don't mean it in a bad way. And once there's that, dig my heels in attitude, it's very hard to overcome. And I tend to say, well, it doesn't matter how you mean it. It's not about you. It's about how it's being perceived.
It's just like any other intent versus impact discussion. So I always tell people that in order to tell whether an action or a sentence is ableist, to take out the disability component of it and substitute something else, substitute gender, substitute people of color, substitute LGBTQ status. And if once you've done the substitution, if that would be considered misogynist, racist, homophobic, guess what? It's also ableist when you go back to your original language. And the same intent versus impact analysis that applies to all of those other dimensions of disability also apply to ableism. And I will point out, and I did write a blog article about this as well, disabled people can be ableist also. When I grew up, I was taught that I had a physical disability, but I was still better off than somebody who had an intellectual disability. And I had to unlearn that as I got older. So I got really angry. We've got this governor in the US who's a wheelchair user, and he keeps on writing this anti-disabled legislation because he's coming from the perspective of, well, I made it, so you shouldn't need help either. And so definitely people with disabilities can be ableist.
Sheri, I want to go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, do you think that that dynamic is a byproduct of a person's, a person's current situation, or just like whatever they're wrestling with? Or do you think it's just this pitting disabled people against each other, society pitting disabled people against each other, because of the way the system was designed, that the ableism exists within the disability community?
So only speaking for myself, I grew up in the 60s, and I was in the first group of children with physical disabilities to be mainstreamed in an education setting. So if I'd been born a year earlier, I would have been shunted off into a disabled children's only program. But it was only people with physical disabilities, people with who were, and we didn't use this phrase then, but people who were neurodivergent or people with intellectual and developmental delays, they weren't mainstream. They were still off into the special program. So that was the message I received as a child that I had to unlearn later as an adult.
There's also this ongoing competition for resources. The blind community is getting a certain amount of resources through government, and there's this perception that things are unfair because in the US they're getting more benefit monthly than someone without a disability, without a visual disability. And then there's even a hierarchy of disabilities. If you're a manual wheelchair user, you're better than someone who uses a power wheelchair, and someone who uses a cane is better than you. And I don't know why this continues to happen, but it's there. And because of that, maybe it's society's pressure on the disability community or reflection. We only mirror what's around us, but that really is causing, I think, a lot of problems. We are the largest minority in the world. A quarter of people have a disability. If we actually work together, the power we'd have.
I totally agree with you, Nick. People out in public treat me completely differently, depending on whether I'm walking because I'm having a good day, or using a cane because I'm having an average day, or because I'm in a wheelchair because it's a longer distance. But it's always the same disability to me. It's the perception of society based on what mobility aids I am or am not using at the time.
Sheri, if you're a wheelchair user and you get out of your wheelchair, you must be faking.
Exactly.
You're in it only for the parking.
Yep, I'm only in it for, believe me, I've heard that before. When people see me disassemble my wheelchair to put it in my car, clearly I'm faking it. Forget the 24 surgeries.
And that comes from total ignorance. I have to say, probably the first time I ran into a wheelchair user in a professional situation, they got up to get a book from the shelf, and I was just mystified, I don't know what to do with this. I'd never seen this before in my life. How do I interpret this? And just what sort of explanation is there for this? And of course, I tried to keep as poker face as I could in the meeting, and then brought it up with my coworker afterwards. But I would be the first person to admit that I'm guilty of that sort of, is it ableism? Is it ignorance? Where does it come from? I guess the thing is well, how do we change this? I mean, does the social model, does this give us a good framework for bringing around cultural change or, educating people? I mean, is it a good starting point for that? Or is it too limited? Reginé, you're unmuted, so I guess you would want to start.
I just had stayed unmuted as I was listening to Sheri and Nick. I think not enough people know. I mean, I would love to know in the chat how many people even knew the social model before coming here today. I think in general, there's this lack of awareness, one. Two, we do need to change our mindsets. We need to change the way that we speak. There's so much that we need to change within ourselves, right? Because it all starts and ends with us. We have crappy technology that doesn't work for a lot of folks because we just don't even think about it in our day-to-day life, right? I think that there is a lot to be done, which is why I feel very lucky that I get to teach people who are learning about technology and who will be building it in the future to incorporate accessibility from the beginning. But we don't have this in a lot of, there are so many engineers who I meet along the way who said I never learned anything about accessibility while I was in school, right? And that just is, to me, how is that possible, right?
Yeah, so going back to my root cause analysis, right? I can count on, 10 fingers probably the number of places that you can take college credits in accessible computer science. And it's not a requirement to ever learn anything about accessibility to get your degree. So why is that? Well, the curriculums are set by accreditation boards. So what do we need to do? We need to get the accreditation board to add a requirement for accessibility in order to get a computer science degree. So that's a conversation that I've started. But one thing that I wanted to add to what you just said, Reginé, is that it isn't just that the technology is terrible, it's that the terrible technology isn't in equally everybody's hands, right? So, you can have Braille note takers and, it might not be an awesome Braille note taker, but only 10% of people who are legally blind use Braille.
Right.
And even then they're between $800 and $2,500. So you need to have the financial resources or be in a state that's got vocational rehabilitation so that you can actually get the government to buy one of those for you. And then there's all kinds of hoops that you have to jump through. And as Nick was pointing out, again, the hierarchies about, well, are you just legally blind or can you see nothing, right? Because people treat those as two different things.
That also trickles down to education, which Sheri, we were just talking about the other day, specifically for education for the younger ones, where advocacy is a vicious game. And it is parents advocating for their children or needing to get attorneys involved to advocate for services, and the government, and for that matter, education system, continuing to push back on that. And the question becomes, what does the child actually need on their IEP, which is an individualized education plan? What do they need for you to consider them, quote unquote, worthy or in a category that you deem applicable to get help in whatever that looks like?
So I've definitely spent a lot of time doing IEPs. Before I got into accessibility, I used to help families with children who were deaf or who had autism with IEPs. So I've done, I think, about 200 of them. And the one thing I learned was that every single state within the United States treats things differently. If you look at the graduation rates from high school for children with IEPs, it ranges from 80% at best, which actually isn't terrible when you look at the overall high school graduation rate in the US, down to 38% in the worst state.
Right.
So why should it matter to me as a disabled child that I live in Nevada versus living in Massachusetts? Because that has more of an impact on whether or not I'm going to go to college than absolutely anything else.
Yeah. And I was evaluating IEPs in New York City, which is a lovely state for education.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know New York City, you actually have to apply to get into a high school. It isn't automatic. It isn't based on where you live. So I have a nephew with a disability in New York, and there were definitely many more struggles for him to get appropriate services than his twin brother, who did not have a disability.
Right. And it goes back to, I think in general, and this is us talking about the social model, it's us talking about perception of disability. I don't know if any of you have read, oh my goodness, it's blanking me now. Oh, Factfulness. Factfulness. It's an incredible book that I would highly recommend if you've not read it yet. But in there, they talk about, or rather he poses the question, they pose the question of why is the misconception of a gap between, rich and poor so hard to change? And they talk about how human beings have a strong, dramatic instinct toward binary thinking. This basic urge to divide things into two distinct groups. We love to dichotomize good versus bad, hero versus villain, normal versus disabled. And I think in general, yeah, especially in politics, I saw Nikki said, well, another webinar, not this one. But this is very much so political, just not long enough. However, if we're talking about root cause analysis, you go back to that, and I feel like everything is rooted in that. How do you change that? Such a big question. Another webinar for another time. Claudio, you look like you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I didn't want to interrupt you because we're just starting to touch such a good subject, and it's so frustrating because we're just so close to the end of our time. So I would just say let's kind of like put the brakes on this while the conversation is good, while we all want to continue the conversation. And I'd love to be able to open this up to questions from folks. And I saw way up there that Christina had a question about what sort of cultural change we could bring about. Of course, I'm scrolling, I still can't find it.
Yep, here are there. There's quite a few. I'm gonna just rattle them off if you want, Claudio.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, that's totally okay. There's so much chatter in here. Thank you so much, everyone. I absolutely love Stark events because everyone is so vocal and active in learning and active in sharing. Thank you, everyone, for this.
So while you're scrolling down that, I want to quickly answer Tink's question about self-identification on job applications. And Tink, if you don't mind, could you answer in the box whether or not you're in the US? Anyways, I'll answer the question for the US first. So when you get that government self-identification form on a job application, there is no penalty for answering the question yes, because it's not associated, it doesn't go to the hiring manager. So I think it's important for people to answer that, because that's what the company uses to determine what is its percentage of employees with people with disabilities. Now, whether or not you disclose any details about that is entirely up to you during the interview process. And so I tend to give different types of advice depending on what field people are applying to, whether or not their disability is visible, whether or not they're comfortable talking about their disability publicly. There's no wrong answer with that one. But those, I wanted to make sure everybody understood that those are two very different things.
Thanks, Sheri. One of the questions that was asked, which I will ask and then quickly share my very strong opinion on and then open it up to anybody else. Are there things you would change about the current accessibility industry to better align the industry with the social model? I would change.
That's an hour there.
It is. I would change. I would change the industry that plays a role in the way the currency runs. It's your tech organizations, it's your Facebooks, it's your Amazons, it's your Twitters. And you go further, it's the people that sit at the top. The fish rots from the head down. You want to change accessibility? Accessibility is a proxy for user experience. Christine, that's a topic for another time, Christine. I think in order for us to change the accessibility industry is a byproduct. It's a byproduct of society othering, of designing people out of the system. And so you need to redesign the actual industry that governs how everything runs. Yeah, I will stop.
And short of that, because that might be harder to fix than working on the industry itself, I think we in the industry need to make more of an effort to hire disabled people in roles of accessibility experts. And we need to do a better job at training young disabled people to come into the accessibility field. And we need to make an effort to do disability awareness training to non-disabled folks but also to disabled folks, because I think one of the problems we often assume that, hey, this person is blind, therefore they know everything they need to know about accessibility, or hey, Nick is in a wheelchair, therefore he knows everything to know about building accessibility. I happen to do so because I've studied it. I made an effort to learn about the ADA accessibility guidelines and the New Zealand accessibility standards and the Canadian building code. I made an effort to learn. So we have to make sure we train people, disabled and not, and we hire more disabled people to do this job.
Yeah, I was astonished when the most recent WebAIM survey said that only 30% of accessibility professionals identify as having a disability. When I'm building teams, I always go for at least 2/3. Now, you always need sighted people on your team. You can't, the question comes up, why isn't it 100% disabled? Because, people who are blind can't test magnification. Completely blind. They can't test color ratios. They can't, there are just things, focus indicators. There are things that they can't test. So there's always going to have to be a small percentage of people but I think it should be, definitely the majority of people on accessibility teams. Why? Because they have lived experience, and that's me smacking the table. You can't, and the most important thing to understand is, even though, you could use a keyboard, you don't use it the same way I do, because I'm a keyboard only user. I can't use a mouse. They're two very different things, and you can't simulate neurodiverse states. You can't simulate being autistic. You can't simulate being dyslexic. So there are just areas where having a disability is essential for accessibility work.
Right.
Kat, do you want to make any closing remarks? Because I know we're like almost at the top of the hour here. I got a couple announcements, and
I mean, the announcements, feel free to close it with. I just, from my part, want to say, as always, thank you. It's I think you look at the people on the panel, and I think it's easy to say they know everything, they know the ins and outs, and I think I'd be lying if I said that coming to these wasn't one of the greatest learning experiences every single time. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to learn from all of you, to hear your questions, to be able to interact with you, to be able to learn from our team and the panelists. So thank you a million times over. Thank you.
And the same for me. I mean, thank you so very much, Reginé, Sheri, Nick, for coming with us, for being here with us today. In 2 weeks, we're going to be doing a follow-up to this meetup. So we're going to be doing one. We still haven't announced it on Meetup yet, but we're going to be doing a meetup titled, How Do You Build an Accessible Society? So we're going to be talking about some of these notions about the social model and seeing how mechanically, or what's the sort of framework that you can extend beyond that to be able to be building a society or be building tech that's much more inclusive. So I hope you'll join us on February 16th for this event, join our meetup group or subscribe somehow so we can get you this notification. So we look forward to seeing a lot of you again in a couple of weeks, and I hope you've really enjoyed today. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Beth.
Thanks,
Thanks everyone.